Fear, the great gateway. Yes. You thought it was a bridge. But the actual great gateway is fear. So obviously I'm going to talk about fear today. I could talk about what fear does, how fear paralyzes, how fear limits you from achieving what you want because you're afraid to step out, how it controls you, how it steals from you, how it even possesses and overwhelms you. I could talk about that. I could talk about how fear is used against you by governments, by churches, by other organizations, civic organizations, social organizations, even by family members, parents over children, husbands over wives. I could talk about all that. But what I want to talk about is how fear can be used to our advantage, and then how we overcome that fear. The one thing about fear that we fail to recognize is that fear is an indicator. Fear is a signpost. Of what? Of an open door. Of a gateway. Fear, collectively, is a great gateway. It's a great big open door in your life. Fear in individual forms that paralyze, that limit, that control, that steal, that possess, that overwhelm. Those are individual doors. Understanding what fear is and what its purpose truly is will help you to overcome it. What we want to do is not be afraid. But I submit to you that being afraid is not the sin. It's allowing yourself to stay afraid. Continue to be afraid when you've recognized that fear is there. That's where you start missing the mark. That's when you start stepping into death because you begin to die to purpose because you're afraid to step out into purpose. If fear and faith are the exact opposites, then the root of fear is mistrust or lack of trust. That lack of trust is rooted in the unknown because if you know something, you can trust it. If you know, let me put it this way. You say, well, but I know that that person's mean. I know that that person's angry. Because you'll say, all right, well, if fear is rooted in the unknown, then that's only on the positive side. No, that's on the positive and negative side. I don't have to be afraid of a piece of machinery that could kill me if I know the potential for it to kill me. I don't have to be afraid of it. I just have to use it properly. If I know that going into a certain place is dangerous to me, it doesn't mean that I have to be afraid to go into that certain place. It just means that I need to be aware of the potential danger there, if I know it. Fear is rooted in the unknown. When we don't know something, we're in a place of mistrust, of misunderstanding, of dread is one of the root words that we'll get into, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we're dreading, we're trembling. That's actually one of the words here in the Greek. It means to tremble. About fear. So fear and faith are the exact opposites. Along this line of, why are you still afraid? Do you still have no faith? Jesus goes out walking on the water. It's recorded in John chapter 6, verse 20, and he says, don't be afraid. And that's actually the word where we get our word phobia. It's phobio in the Greek. And it means to put to flight by terrifying, to scare away. Makes me think of the garden. When the Lord came to Adam and Eve and he said, where are you? He was saying, where's the image that I created? Where is the true identity? Where's your true identity? Because once they lost their true identity, what did they say? We were afraid and we hid. We no longer knew who we were, so we ran. That's what this is talking about. It's a phobia. It's a fear to put to flight by terrifying. Jesus comes out there walking on the water, and recorded in Mark chapter 6, it says that they thought he was a ghost. He's walking on the water towards them. They're out there rowing. They thought he was a ghost, and they cried out in fear. And he says, "Do not be afraid." And the coolest thing about it is he said, "It is I." The Greek word ego. It's I. It's me. Don't be afraid. It's me. That's the key to this whole thing. Understanding what fear is the absence of knowing. And ultimately, we need to know the Lord. We need to get into that depth of relationship, but you can apply it to everywhere. If you know a room, it doesn't matter whether the light's on or not. You're not afraid of bumping into anything. But if you don't know the room, or somebody's moved something in the room and you're not sure, then you have an apprehension about walking through that room because you might smash into something that you don't know is there. But if you flip on the light, now you can see everything that's there. You know what's there. Anybody walk through a lit room afraid of bumping into things? Not on average. Most people don't. I'm sure there are some people that have a fear of running into things somewhere out there. That's a phobia. Jesus says to them, "Don't be afraid." Why? Because I'm here. You know me. They didn't know who he was. They said, "It's a ghost." Then he said, "Don't be afraid. Don't be in phobia. Don't be terrified so that you run away. It's me." This is the essence of our faith. Our faith is to the place where we take the Lord's hand and we begin this walk and this journey and we say, "Lord, I don't know all that's going on, but you do, and I'm going to trust you, and therefore I don't have to be afraid of anything. I don't have to be fearful of anything." So what is the purpose of fear in our life? Fear is an indicator of something that we do not know. Fear lets us know you don't know something. Doesn't mean that we are supposed to run away. What it means is that we are supposed to acknowledge it and then take it to the Lord. I've been dealing with some things over the last month, some fears that the Lord's uprooting in my life, and this is part of where this is coming from. And certain things will happen, and this apprehension will rise up within me. And before, I used to just ignore it or push it away. And the Lord began to show me that I was allowing it to stay there, allowing the door to continue to be open. And over the last few weeks, the Lord's been teaching me more and more just to simply, immediately, when I feel that apprehension, to confess that fear. Before, I just didn't want to acknowledge it. You know what it says, casting down every thought? That's what I would do. I'd just cast down the thought. I refuse to be afraid. The Lord began to show me, he's like, confess that fear. And I'm like, okay. And I began to confess that fear. And I'd say, I confess the fear of that. And the more that I've begun to confess that, the less of a foothold it's had on me. Glory. The less I'm apprehensive about those situations. And I could explain those situations, and some of you know those situations, but they're just things in life. What are some things in life that you're fearful of? Fearful of losing a job. Fearful of whatever. I could name a bunch of things, and I could start hitting home with a lot of people, and we would feel like we're being picked on. And that's not my desire. I want you to discover what the things you're fearful of. But what I want to explain to you above all of this is that fear is the great gateway. Job said it, and I've mentioned this before in other teachings, but Job said in Job chapter 3, recorded in Job chapter 3, he said, "That which I have feared most has come upon me." What you fear is an indicator, it's a doorway for the enemy to have legal access. And eventually, the Lord will pull back that hedge of protection as he did with Job and say, I have to allow the enemy to have legal access because I don't want you to live in fear anymore. And I've tried to explain it this way, and I've tried to explain it that way, and I've tried to take you through this and take you through that to bring it to your attention, and you don't want to acknowledge it. Because every time that Job had that apprehension, that fear that his kids might have done something wrong, he ran over and tried to make a sacrifice for them. And God was trying through that fear to give him an indication of, hey, you're not operating out of trust and faith and knowing that those kids are in my hands. You're operating out of fear. And it should be telling you that's a lack of trust. But instead, you're operating out of it. You're being controlled by it. You're being consumed by it. And I'm protecting you. And the Lord said at a certain point, I have to pull back my hand of protection because I cannot bless you while you are consumed with fear. I cannot prosper you while you are consumed with this fear. You know, the Lord can take us so far. And then there comes a point where things have got to be uprooted. Things have got to be tested in our lives. He wants to take us all the way. So, he says, pay attention to what's going on in your life. The difference between the known and the unknown. Phobia. A phobeo. Phobeo. That's the Greek word. It has a root, phobos. It means fear, dread, terror. So the original word, to put to flight by terrifying. To scare away, to put to flight, to flee. Anybody ever felt like running? That's an indicator. When you've overcome your fear, you don't feel like running. You feel like standing your ground. But are you standing your ground out of a trust and knowing, or out of fear again? Because that's the other word. The other word is dread. It means to be timid or fearfulness or cowardice. They say that both the hero and the coward are the same. One uses his fear and cowardice to run away. The other uses his fear and cowardice to run into the battle. I've listened to many soldiers who were in battle, and they talk about how people look at him and go, "You're such a hero, you stood up and you fought." And they go, "No, I was just so afraid I couldn't do anything but run into that battle." It wasn't, we're talking about men who fight reluctantly, not people that are raised up to fight and kill. In 2 Timothy 1:7, it says, "For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind." That word fear is the word that is closely translated as dread. In the Webster's 1828 dictionary, it's the primary sense is to tremble. Great fear, apprehension. It means to tremble, to shake, to worry. Fear is the gateway or the legal door left open to attack, and that word means to tremble or dread. The Greek word that Job used in Job 3:25 is pahad. It's P-A-C-H-A-D. But it's pronounced a little bit pahad. Because I listen to the pronunciations. If you go to Blue Letter Bible, it gives you the pronunciations. I have to listen to those so I pronounce it correctly. Try to at least pronounce it correctly. So what are you afraid of? What do you dread? What makes you tremble? Those are gateways that you need to start closing. They're access points rooted in the unknown that can only be closed by faith. It takes stepping into a place and saying, "Lord, I recognize that I'm fearful of this thing. I confess that fear." Period. That's it. That's the whole thing. As soon as it rises up within you, I confess that fear. What are you doing? You are closing the door. You're opening yourself up to faith and trust in the Lord. You're neutralizing that area of attack from the enemy. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to just leave myself open to any given attack and just get beat up for no reason. I want to shut doors that I don't need to have open in my life. I don't really need to have that open in my life. I want to move on. I want to do these other things. So what are these areas? What are the areas of fear? What are the areas of dread? What are you afraid of? What makes you tremble? Those are open doors in your life that the enemy has legal access to. If you read the story of Job, it doesn't say, as our translated texts read, and they say, the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? It's not what he was doing. The actual Hebrew text says, you have been considering my servant Job, or more literally, you have had your heart set on my servant Job. And Satan's response is, yes, but you've had a hedge of protection around him. You've put a wall around him to keep me from getting at the door that he left wide open. I've said it a lot of times to different people. Locks and doors only keep out honest people, because if a thief wants to get in, he'll break that door down. But the thing about a door is, it is a deterrent. So the enemy will try to come in and lie to you, to deceive you, to speak things over you, to try to influence you, even if a door is closed. But if a door is wide open, he has legal access to come and mess with so many other things. He didn't have to lie to Job because the door was open. And once the Lord pulled back the hedge of protection, the enemy came right in and wiped out everything in his life. Wiped out his livestock, wiped out his family, and then eventually took his health. All because Job kept that door of fear open. Apparently I have an email. No, but I didn't think to hit the silence on here. Oops. So what are your phobias? What are your fears? What are your aversions? I want you to be set free and deal with them. I want you to look at them properly. They use a psychological term called reframing. It means that you can look at any situation and find the positive. See the positive aspects in it. That's the psychological term, is to reframe. So you look at any situation and reframe. Before I knew that that's what the psychological term was, that's what the Lord's taught me to do for many years. I can look at any situation and ask the Lord and say, what am I supposed to see here that's good, that's positive, that's coming out of this? We need to start looking at fear differently. We need to start looking at fear properly. Fear is an indicator. Fear is a doorpost. Fear is a neon sign in your life saying there's an open door that makes you vulnerable to attack. Start dealing with it. When you feel apprehensive, when you feel fearful, when you want to run, even if you want to attack because you're afraid. One of the difficulties that I have with some of our dogs that we have here, between the neighbor dogs and our dogs that we have, is they all operate out of fear. I have to put one rooster in a separate cage because the rooster is completely fearful. He beats everybody else up. If I let him out, he'll attack all the other chickens. And when you get close to him, he's the most fearful out of all of them. So what's he operating out of? Fear. And he attacks. He lashes out of that fear. He's afraid of being dominated, so he tries to dominate everybody else. That is the number one operating system within the world today. I'm fearful, and I'm going to operate out of that fear. That's why I said I could talk about what goes on in the churches, I could talk about what goes on in government, I could talk about what goes on in civic places. They all use tactics of fear because they're the most fearful, because they're consumed with fear. And instead of addressing their fear, they operate out of it. And they're limited, they're controlled, they're trembling. They don't want it exposed. But the Lord wants to raise us up as a people who confront fear, who see it for what it is, and who do not operate out of it, but use it properly. I always wondered, I said, you know what's, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I thought, how can we use the same word fear, don't be afraid, over here, and yet over here we're saying that that's where we got to start, is fear. One place says fear is the beginning. One place says don't be afraid at all. And I said, how does that make sense, Lord? How does that make sense? What the dichotomy there, the paradox between the two? And he said, fear is just an indicator of an open door. Fear, reverence and awe for the Lord, indicates an open door to the Lord. Fear of man indicates an open door to the influences of man, the control of men. Don't be afraid of men. Be afraid of God. But it's not that place where we want to be apprehensive and fearful and running away, but running to. If I know that there is a safe place to run to when the battle starts, I want to run to that safe place. That's why the first thing that they do when they get to a battleground, in many of the battles, the first thing that they would do is they would establish a front and then immediately dig foxholes. A foxhole is a safe place in the battle. And you pop up out of your foxhole and you take some shots at the enemy and you pop back in your safe place. They understand that in the military. During World War I, they had the trench wars. They dug all these big trench lines and they would fight back and forth these trench lines. They fought from a safe place. Are we fighting from a safe place? Are we fighting from the arms of God? Are we fighting from that place of known? Or are we fighting from a place of unknown? Do we make the assumptions that when something happens, do we operate out of fear when something happens? When something happens, do we automatically go, yeah, I've been having some conversations lately, and it's been beautiful to hear some people that say, you know, something happens in their life, and they go, yeah, but it's okay, because the Lord knew it was going to happen. I didn't know it was going to happen, but you know what? I'm not trusting me. I'm trusting the Lord. Lord, you knew this was going to happen, so you know how it's going to work out, and you know how you're going to fix it, because you work out everything for my good. I've seen you do it before, and you'll do it again. And I will not get into fear or frustration or anxiety. What does it say? Cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Cast all your fears. We're not supposed to operate out of fear, but we need to use fear properly. It's not wrong to feel fear. It's wrong to allow fear to control and manipulate you and not see it for what it is. Again, it's an indicator. It's a neon sign in your life saying, there's an open door. Now work on closing it. Start today. I confess fear of this. I confess fear of that. I confess fear of this. As soon as that anxiety comes up within you. Now, it would be fine to start confessing fear of things that you just know in your life. Well, I know I'm fearful of this. I know I'm fearful of that. Okay. That would work. But what I really want to encourage you to do is confess fear in the moment. When that anxiety rises up, when that fear rises up in that moment, that's your biggest opportunity to fix your eyes on the Lord and to say, I confess fear of this thing right now. There's power there. You've not been given a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. So if you know, right in that moment, fear's coming on you, trying to overwhelm you, that's when you can stop. That's when you can say, I'm going to close that door. How do I close that door? Through confession. I confess fear of such and such, of this, of that, whatever it is. And like I said, I could make this message 2 hours long just by going through the different aspects of things. Fear of not knowing, not having enough food. Fear of not having enough money. Fear of not having what? What is it? I'm pretty sure we could go around the room and just start listing off the different things, the different examples of fear. I don't care about the examples. Like I said at the beginning, I could talk about all that stuff. I don't want to empower fear. I want to recognize how to use it properly. Say, using fear properly? Yes, because it's going to come. There's nobody here that doesn't feel fear. It's what you do with it that matters. Don't be afraid. What did the Lord... if you go through Scripture, you can find example after example after example of this difference between the known and the unknown. God comes to Abram at the time, and he says, don't be afraid. I am your very great reward. Joshua takes over from Moses. The Lord says to him, be strong and very courageous. Do not be afraid. I am with you. Don't let this book of the law depart from you, but meditate on it day and night. There are things that the Lord has said to you, that desires to say to you, that you need to be meditating on. And when fear comes up, recognize it as the neon sign saying there's an open door, and I want you to close it. I want you to close that door so that the enemy no longer has legal access, so that you can operate in what is it? Fear of being alone? Fear of failure? What is motivating you? Is it faith, trust in the Lord? Or is it fear? Fear should not be the motivator. Fear should be the indicator. Faith should be the motivator. Do you get this? What you got, guys?
Thought I wanted to recognize for myself that it's not just
Right.
that's fear. It's anxiety and worrying about something and whatever all the other things are. Those are fear too.
Yeah.
So I just want to keep that in mind, so that you're telling me to recognize it and confess it. I want to make sure I get them all.
Exactly. Like I said with the animals, the neighbor dogs start barking, our dogs start barking, and I look out there and I just observe. And they're not being protective. They're not announcing something's going on. They're operating completely out of fear. They're afraid of them. They're afraid of them. And if they get together, they're so afraid of each other that they'll fight to try to overcome the fear of each other. If I can defeat you, if I can beat you up, then that proves that I'm no longer afraid. No, that proves that you're the most afraid, because you have to attack. When you have to attack, that shows that you're the most afraid. That's why people want to get into debates and arguments and different things like that. And it says have nothing to do with foolish arguments, which only cause division. Why do they want to get into that? Because they're afraid that they might be wrong. And they don't want to do what they need to do to investigate whether they're right or not. They don't want to go through and analyze it and apply some critical thinking to it and go, you know what? I might be wrong here, and I'm going to investigate this to find out the truth. What they want to do is attack somebody else. And if they can defeat them in an argument, then they don't have to actually investigate whether their argument's correct or not. So they'll prey upon weaker people. I've been around different people like that. Not for very long, but I've been around different people where they gravitate towards people that they feel are weaker or less informed to try to influence them or have an argument with them and try to persuade them to their side because they don't want to do the investigation. And you can find it out when you really go down and say, have you really looked at this? Mm-hmm. They give you things like, oh, well, I know what I'm talking about. I know this. Okay, let's have a debate about it. No, let's change the subject. And it comes in all these different ways. Fear comes out in anxiety, trembling, running away, fighting. And I want us to be equipped so that we're not controlled by it, but that we use fear as the proper indicator in our life. So yeah, whatever word you use, no matter what word, I like the word dread too.
Actually, I have a question. We had a teaching, I don't remember who we were listening to, but it was talking about a college, and there was two spirits that were over top of it, but the root of the main one was fear. Do you remember what the other two?
There actually was fear, but it manifested in
insecurity.
Insecurity and intimidation.
Inferiority.
Or inferiority and insecurity, correct.
I just thought that tied in with what you were saying.
Yeah. That's another set. Inferiority, insecurity. That's fear. Why? Because you don't know who you. If you feel inferior, you feel insecure, Inferiority is, I don't know who I really am. Because if you know who you really are, then you're secure in what your abilities are. That's true humility. Humility is not, oh, I'm nothing, I'm worthless. True humility is, I know my talents and abilities. I know God's talents and abilities. We're in partnership. I'm going to operate in what I can operate in, and the Lord's going to take care of what I can't. That's why Paul said, I am perfected in my weakness. His power is made perfect in my weakness. Where I'm strong, I operate. Where he's strong and I'm weak, he operates through me. That's true humility. And it gets rid of inferiority. The insecurity is not knowing where you're at. I was listening to something yesterday, actually over the last few days, something I've listened to before. I was re-listening to it. And it had to do with a little bit of fear because that's how the world operates. But one of the ideas in there was that we have transitioned from a society that operated out of survival into a society that operates out of amusement and distraction. So we no longer work in our respective areas in order to survive and even thrive in that, but I mean survive in the aspect of making sure the family's fed. Now we go to jobs to get money so that we can play, so that we can feel amused. And because of that, the crux of the whole argument that they were talking about was that because of that aspect that is occurring in our lives now, as a people, as a whole, is that we will do just about anything for that paycheck. We will do things that we despise and we hate because we have to have that paycheck to continue to amuse ourselves, continue to keep distracting ourselves. And at the core of that is a fear of not having enough of that money. Whereas if you stripped everything away and all you had was your home and your family, not even your home, just your family, and that instinct to survive, there are levels that you could live with and thrive and be satisfied. I'm amazed sometimes watching the documentaries and I see people that they have no home. They live in the dirt. And they've learned, there's one group that I watched in Africa where they've literally learned how to prop their head up on their elbow properly to sleep. Because if they put their head on the ground, there's certain worms and bugs that will get in their mouth and ears and nose and stuff like that. But if their head's off the ground, they're fine. Doesn't mess with them. So they've learned to prop their head up. And most of us would think, well, why don't you just get a job and build a house? That's not important to them. They don't care about that comfort, that amusement. And I can tell you that they're more fulfilled than most people in the Western world because they don't have all this other stuff that's telling them you're inadequate, you're inferior, you're less because you don't have this thing. That's all garbage. And that's a fear. It's rooted in fear. Insecurity and inferiority, exactly.